Hi, and welcome back to Psychology 2. We're going to look at part 2 of the developmental chapter. And here we're going to pick up at the cognitive and moral development. Now that's going to include Koberg and Erickson. We're going to look at infant attachment and parenting styles, and then we're going to look at the social development in adolescence and adulthood. So let's start with cognitive and moral development over the lifespan. Now, these attributes are further developed in our adolescence and into our adulthood. Probably one of the most influential researchers in this area was Jean Piaget. He studied children's means of making sense of constructing of the world. So if we look at the cognitive development from infancy to childhood, the ways in which children mentally represent and think about the world. Now, what's common in this component about thinking about the world and representing it is what's known as a schema. It's a pattern of action or mental structures involved in acquiring and organizing knowledge. Now, there are two interacting ways in which children form their schemas. If you wanted to use schemas as a mental map, how do you create your mental map? So the two interacting ways that children form their schemas is what's known as assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation, responding to new stimuli through a reflex or existing habit. And accommodation is the creation of new ways of responding to objects or looking at the world. So there's a transfer existing schema to incorporate these new events. And Jean Piaget developed these stages of cognitive development and looking at how the students or how the children gain new information and what is the process. Piaget hypothesized that children's cognitive processes develop in an orderly, sequential stages. There can be some variation in children, however, everyone goes through the stages and we don't skip them and we can't speed up through them. All right, so let's look at each of these stages. There's the first stage is known as the sensomotor stage, and it's roughly from birth to 2 years of age. The newborn is capable of assimilation. By about 8 to 12 months of age, the infant realizes that objects that are removed from sight still exist. You remember the game Peekaboo? It disappears and then it reappears. And this is called object permanence. This stage is dominated by learning to coordinate perception of the self and the environment with motor activities. The second stage is the pre-operational stage, and this is generally between 2 and 7 years of age, and it's characterized by the use of the words and symbols to represent objects and relationships among those objects. Thinking that is governed by perception rather than logic. As a result, the following concepts are common in this stage. Now, the first concept that's common is what's known as egocentrism. Now, egocentrism is a consequence of one-dimensional thinking found at this stage. It is a child's inability to grasp the point of view of another person. They're strictly in their own world. Another word to be expressed here is what's called animism. It's attributing life and consciousness to physical objects like the sun and the moon. And then the third, what we can touch on, is artificialism, the belief that environmental events like the rain and thunder are human inventions. Now, if you check out on page 193, table 8.2, you'll find examples of these plus the definitions. Now, in this stage, conservation is the issue. Conservation states basic properties of substances remain the same. In other words, they conserve when you change superficial properties such as the shape. Now, when children are in this pre-operational stage, they're developing this ability. So, for example, you give a child a long, slender beaker filled with water right to the top, and you pour that long, slender beaker into a broad, stout one. It's definitely shorter, rounder, and you've got this long, slender one, and you pour it in, and you say to the child, which one has the most fluid? Like which one holds the most? And most children who haven't completed this stage will point to the tall, slender one because it's taller. It appears bigger. But children who are past that stage, and they could be the same age children, you'll see this in a grade 1-2 class, is that some students will tell you the tall one. The students that have passed this stage will recognize that they hold the same amount of fluid. They just have different shapes. The third stage is known as the concrete operational stage. This is between 7 and 11 years of age. And children ages 7 to 11, they show the beginnings of the capacity for adult logic. Children typically do better with tangible or very concrete rather than abstract ideas. Children become less egocentric and can take another person's point of view a little easier. The term reversibility is the recognition that many processes can be reversed or undone, returning to their previous condition. Children have the ability to focus on two dimensions of a problem at once. That's called decentration. Then we move to the formal operation stage, and this is the onset of adolescence to adulthood. The final stage of Piaget's theory begins at around 11 or 12 years of age, and it's highlighted by abstract thought. It includes the ability to classify, use of logic thought, and the ability to hypothesize. The ability to solve geometric problems, focus on multiple aspects of a problem all at one time. Now, when we consider Piaget's theory, unlike Piaget's stage theory, another researcher by the name of Lev Vygotsky, he's a social cultural theory, took a different path. Vygotsky, he looked at the social cultural theory, considered how the transmission of information and cognitive skills from one generation to the next. He felt that the child adapts to their cultural interactions, and he introduced two key concepts. One was the zone of proximal development. What Vygotsky was referring to was the range of tasks that a child can carry out with the help of someone who is skilled. Now, one of the other considered terms that he used in relationship to that was what's known as scaffolding, and that's used in today's educational system now. Scaffolding refers to the temporary supports provided by a parent or a teacher to a child who is learning to perform a new task. As the skill is learned, the guidance is reduced, increasing the skill and the confidence of the child to complete that task themselves. Now, when we move to the sort of cognitive development in adolescence, adolescents are able to deal with the abstract and the hypothetical. A big departure from childhood. Even so, there's still growth and development to be had in adolescence. A carryover from childhood is egocentrism. Adolescent egocentrism pressed for acceptance of their logic without recognizing there might be exceptions. Egocentric thought is that component. This can give rise to two cognitive developments: imaginary audience and personal fable. Let's look at those. And this is an adolescent's condition or circumstance. It doesn't apply in all instances, but it largely occurs in adolescence. Imaginary audience. This is the belief that other people are as concerned with your thoughts and behavior as you are yourself. It's an imaginary audience because really not everyone feels the same as you. And then the fable, or the personal fable, is the belief that our feelings and ideas are somehow special. We are unique and invulnerable. Behaviors such as showing off and risk-taking are seen at this particular time. Now we're going to move into the cognitive development of adulthood. And here the characteristics of this stage, creativity, memory functioning, and intelligence, all are at their height in adulthood. The memory function does decline with age, and people do tend to retain their verbal skills and general knowledge into advanced ages. Two concepts that apply in this stage is crystallized versus fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence represents a lifetime of attainment, including vocabulary and accumulated facts. Typically, it increases over the decades. It makes sense. The more life you live, the more life you have in your head. Therefore, you have these accumulated facts and a more rich vocabulary. Fluid intelligence represents mental flexibility. It's the ability to process information rapidly, learning and solving new problems. Now we'll touch on some significant work done by Lawrence Kohlberg. It's on moral development. He proposed 3 levels of moral development, and we're going to look at each level. The first is what he called the pre-conventional level, and it's based on moral judgment on the consequences of behavior. It applies to most children through the age of 9. And with this comes a couple of stages. The first stage is to orientate towards obedience and punishment. The second stage is good behavior allows people to satisfy their needs and those of others. The second stage, or the second phase, I guess is better than stage, second phase is the conventional level, where moral reasoning is judged by conformity to conventional standards of right and wrong. Familial right or wrong, religious right or wrong, societal right or wrong. So stage 3 would be moral behavior is that which meets the expectations of others. And the fourth stage is that moral judgments are based on rules that maintain the social order. The last grouping is the post-conventional level. Stages 5 and 6 of moral reasoning become much more complex. Adolescents are able to take into account personal consciousness and human rights and weigh these against the need to follow the rules and maintain social order. If we were to evaluate Kohlberg's theory, there might be there is evidence supports that the view that moral judgments of children develop in an upward sequence. Education is likely to play a role in adolescents achieving post-conventional thought. Kohlberg may have underestimated the influence of social, cultural, and educational institutions. Of course, what role do parents play? And there could be many roles, and of course, every person's background influences the role that they play. Are there gender differences in moral development? Well, if we use the Heinz dilemma, Heinz must decide, this is the guy, we'll call him Heinz, that's why it's the Heinz dilemma. Heinz must decide whether to steal an expensive drug that offers the only hope of saving his dying wife. Boys show, so that's essentially the dilemma. Do you steal it for your wife or do you not? And there's the moral development. Carol Gilligan propose that this is due to different socialization patterns for boys and girls. And the point she's making is that boys tend to show a higher level of moral development than girls. Now, Carol Gilligan proposed that this could be due to different socialization patterns between boys and girls, not the differences in morality. Girls are socialized to focus on the needs of others and forego simplistic judgments of right and wrong. Boys make judgments based on logic. Now we'll move to our social development and social relations. Social relations are crucial. As children, our very survival depends on our social relations. Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development is what we're going to be exploring, and Erikson believed that individuals progress through 8 psychosocial stages during their lifespan, each defined by a conflict with the social environment that must be resolved in order to move to the next. Stage 1, trust versus mistrust. And it's based on the interactions with our primary caregivers when we're infants. The infant must gain a sense of predictability and trust in its caregivers, or it risks development of mistrust and a mistrust nature. So when children cry and we respond, they start to see a predictability and trust in the caregiver. If they cry and we don't respond, and we do sometimes, then it doesn't build the same level of predictability, and therefore a lack of trust in that predictability, which could make for mistrust. Erikson's second stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt. Early childhood and preschool years, our relationships encourage us to develop autonomy, or feelings of shame and guilt. Stage 3, the initiative versus guilt. During the school years, friends and teachers encourage us to become industrious, or if we don't engage, we may start to develop feelings of inferiority. So these are the conflicts that we all work our way through on psychosocial development. Now, stage 4, competence versus inferiority. Now we're into adolescence by this point, and it's adolescents struggle to define themselves. Who am I versus who are you? Stage 5 is ego identity versus role confusion. Now by definition, ego identity is a firm sense of who you are and what you stand for. If this isn't accomplished, then role diffusion is experienced. And role diffusion is spreading yourself too thin and running down one alley after another trying to figure things out. Stage 6, intimacy versus isolation. Now, Erikson proposed that young adults enter a stage of intimacy versus isolation. This is marked by the establishment of intimate relationships. The ability to share, care for, commit themselves to another person. Without this, isolation and being unsure of oneself. Stage 7 this is generativity versus stagnation. Now, generativity is doing things that we believe are worthwhile. This enhances self-esteem and helps shape a new generation. Well, compare that to stagnation, which is treading water and has a powerful destructive effect on self-esteem. Stage 8 is ego integrity versus despair. Now, ego integrity derives from wisdom, expert knowledge, balance, and excellence. Now, we're going to visit Erikson's stages a little later in this video. I want to move to infant attachment, which is another factor that influences our development. Now, by definition, James Bowlby was the first attachment theorist, and his work pioneered the work of Mary Ainsworth. Now, her work around attachment is the emotional tie that is formed between animal or person to another. Attempts to maintain contact or nearness shows anxiety when separated. So the theoretical views of attachment, behaviorists view that attachment is learned through experience. Now, Harry Harlow, he suggested that skin contact may be more important than learning experiences. Now, you might know his experiment with rhesus monkeys, where he created a wire mesh entity, we'll just say, and a terry cloth mothers to demonstrate that rhesus monkeys, when they're in danger, prefer the terry cloth mother over the wire mesh. They concluded here that there may be an inborn need for contact comfort. Konrad Lorenz, he's an ethnologist, he noted that attachment is an instinct. And there's a critical period, a period during which the animal is sensitive to stimuli. If it moves, it must be a mother. The formation of attachment in this manner is called imprinting. The strange situation and patterns of attachment, the bonds between caretaker and infant, researchers like Ainsworth have identified 4 types of attachment. The first is what's known as secure attachments. Infants mildly protest their mother's departure, and they seek interaction upon their return, and are readily comforted. Children with secure attachment are happier, more sociable, and cooperative, and have longer attention spans and are less impulsive and liked by peers and teachers, and they have fewer behavior problems. The second form of attachment is known as avoidant attachment. Infants are least distressed by their mother's departures. They play by themselves and ignore their mothers when they return. Resistant attachment infants are the most emotional, showing severe signs of distress when their mothers leave, and showing ambivalence upon reunion by alternately clinging and pushing away their mothers. The fourth type is what's known as disorganized or disorientated attachment. The infant exhibits contradictory and ambivalent responses that are indicative of distress upon the caregiver's return. Now, developmental psychologists also study the parenting styles in relation to personality development. And some of the parenting styles, instrumental competence. That's the ability to manipulate the environment to achieve a goal. Parental behavior research by Bomren focused on 4 aspects of parental behavior. The first was strictness. The second, demands for a child to achieve intellectual, emotional, and social maturity. 3, communication ability. And 4, the warmth and involvement. Now, based on research in this area, 4 parenting styles have been proposed. Authoritative, strict, but willing to reason with their children. Parents set high, but realistic, reasonable standards, and they enforce limits. At the same time, they encourage open communication and independence. Most competent children come from this type of family and parenting style. Children of warm parents are more likely to be socially and emotionally well-adjusted. They also internalize moral standards. They develop a consciousness, greater self-reliance, self-esteem, social competence, and achievement motivation. The second group is known as authoritarian. Parents make the rules, expect unquestioned obedience from their children, and punish misbehavior, often physically, and value obedience to authority. Children of authoritarian parents are often withdrawn, aggressive, and usually don't do as well in school. The third type of parenting is what's known as permissive. Parents through are warm and supportive, but make very few rules or demands and usually don't enforce those that are made. They allow children to make their own decisions and control their own behavior. Children of permissive parents are less mature and impulsive, moody and aggressive. Delinquency seen in adolescence along with continued poor academic performance. The fourth group is what's known as the uninvolved parent. This is leaving children on their own, making few demands, showing little warmth and encouragement. Children of uninvolved parents obtain poorer grades, hang out with the crowd at parties and deal with and use drugs. Okay, now here's where we revisit Erikson's stages. Here we're going to look at the social development from adolescence through emerging adulthood, young adulthood, middle adulthood, and you guessed it, late adulthood. So let's begin with the social development of adolescence, the relationship with peers and parents. With adolescents becoming more independent and searching for who they are, it can pit adolescents and parents to be in conflict. This, of course, can be affected by many concepts already touched on, like parenting style, parental attachment. But by revisiting Erikson's psychosocial stages of development, we're going to touch on those that will affect from adolescence to late adulthood, and in particular, the points of the ego conflict at these stages related to each stage of life. Again, you may want to go back to page 200, I think it is, and table 8.5. Let's begin with the ego identity and role confusion. In adolescence, gain a solid sense of who you are and what you stand for. Now, this can be a great advantage going forward. Not gaining ego identity, one may experience role confusion. And here we do not handle we don't really have much of a handle, I mean to say, on who we are, and therefore we're not very focused, or we can't find solid ground to stand on. We struggle in life if we can't identify who we are and what we stand for. If we move to the social development of adulthood and emerging adulthood, this is a relatively new stage of development. This stage is highlighted by delaying marriage and parenthood, post-secondary education. These transitions are delayed and put off until late 20s and early 30s. When the social development does not end in adolescence, it continues throughout life. And the young adult, here we tend to hit our stride. We are more independent. Maybe we have a career on the way, making our own choices. It's during this stage that we face the next ego conflict, intimacy versus isolation. Intimacy is central to establishing a solid, intimate relationship. In order to achieve this merging, a solid sense of self is really important. Now, not achieving this development can lead to a sense of isolation and disappointment. And isolation is really just this, you don't feel as connected to people. Now, we move to middle adulthood. Generavity versus stagnation is the stage of this time of life. Being able to contribute to the next generation, to have things to do that are purpose-filled, is generavity. Stagnation represents when we don't have any interest in new or anything about what we can grow. This can damage our sense of self. It is in this period of life that we may experience what is known as the midlife crisis. This is the period of life where we are working hard and focused on now. Then we stop to consider 10 to 20 years in the future and start to feel depressed. Too far to go to retire and not enough time to get done what needs to be get done. By late adulthood, well, here we're experiencing Erikson's ego integrity versus despair stage, and here we try to keep seeing that there is purpose and meaning in our life. We are less interested in accumulating stuff as we are with seeing value in what we do. And then lastly, and not leastly, there's the death, the end of our development. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross identified 5 stages of coming to terms with death: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Let's look at them. Denial. This is the shock, the disbelief that this is somehow not right. That can't be possible. Anger, like, why me? Why them? Anger, resentment, and envy. 3, bargaining. Well, I deny, I'm angry, and I'm still not going to go well, so I'm going to bargain. I'm going to bargain with God, strike a deal to postpone death, find some promise that I can make that will give me more time. Then 4, depression or sadness. Sadness over the past and impending losses. And then finally, 5, acceptance. Struggling against death ends contemplating is coming without fear or despair. Now, what happens upon a person's death for those around them is what's known as bereavement, a period of grieving following death. It can linger long afterwards. Those who suffer the most intense grief initially, who weep inconsolably and feel the deepest pain, do not get through their bereavement more quickly than others. There's a term known as dual process coping. Periods of grieving and periods of relief can be effective as a means of coping with loss of a loved one. For most people, the loss of a spouse is the most stressful event of a lifetime, and it leaves the remaining members with a great risk for health risks or higher mortality rate themselves, particularly in the first 6 months. That's the completion of this chapter on development. Not sure it was what you were expecting. Researchers have researched more human development than maybe you knew. Next week, we're going to explore the branch of psychology known as social psychology. So we'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.